Imagine this. It's 1943, deep in Nazi-occupied Poland, and a German SS officer is standing in a small clinic holding a vial of blood in his gloved hand. The test results are positive. Typhus, the most feared epidemic of World War II. A disease so contagious, so deadly, that even the Third Reich, with all its brutality and efficiency, would rather abandon an entire region than risk infection spreading through their ranks. The officer stares at the doctor in front of him, a quiet Polish physician named Eugene Lazowski, and asks the question that could unravel everything. How many cases? Lazowski doesn't flinch. He calmly reports that the entire area, over a dozen villages, is infected. Quarantine protocols must be enforced immediately. The SS officer nods, seals the vial, and within hours German troops are pulling back, setting up roadblocks, and marking the region as a death zone. But here's the secret they never discovered. There was no typhus, not a single actual case. The epidemic was fake, a meticulously crafted medical illusion designed by two doctors who turned science into a weapon, and in doing so, saved 8,000 Jewish lives from the gas chambers. This is not a story you'll find in most history books. It's not taught in schools. There are no Hollywood movies about it, no monuments, no annual remembrance ceremonies. Eugene Lazowski and his colleague Stanisław Matulewicz operated in the shadows, and when the war ended, they disappeared back into ordinary life, their secret buried under the avalanche of 6 million tragedies. But what they did was nothing short of genius. They didn't fire a single bullet. They didn't blow up a train or smuggle refugees across borders. Instead, they weaponized fear itself, exploiting the one thing the Nazis were terrified of, a disease that didn't discriminate between conqueror and conquered. And they did it using nothing more than test tubes, bacteria, and a deep understanding of how the human immune system could be tricked into lying. To understand how audacious this plan was, you need to understand the world they were living in. By 1943, Poland had been under Nazi occupation for nearly 4 years. The Jewish population was being systematically erased. Ghettos had been liquidated. Trains were running day and night to Treblinka, Auschwitz, Sobibor. In the countryside, where Lazowski practiced medicine, Jews were either hiding in attics and barns or awaiting deportation. The SS conducted regular sweeps, checking papers, hunting for anyone who looked suspicious, anyone who might be hiding their identity. There was no safe place, no escape route. The net was tightening. And in the middle of this nightmare, in a small town called Rozwadów, a 30-year-old doctor was staring at a medical journal, reading about a peculiar reaction involving the Weil Felix test, and realizing that he might have just found a way to turn the Third Reich's own paranoia against them. Eugene Lazowski was not a resistance fighter in the traditional sense. He was a family man, a physician trained in infectious diseases, someone who took an oath to save lives. But under occupation, that oath took on a new meaning. Saving lives didn't mean prescribing medicine or setting broken bones. It meant finding ways to keep people out of the hands of the Gestapo. It meant forging documents, hiding refugees, and when necessary, lying to the most dangerous regime in human history. Lazowski had already been helping Jews in small ways, providing false medical certificates, treating patients who couldn't risk going to a German-controlled hospital. But he knew it wasn't enough. The deportations were accelerating. Entire communities were vanishing overnight. He needed something bigger, something that would create a barrier the Nazis wouldn't dare cross. That's when he remembered the typhus test. The Weil Felix test was the standard diagnostic tool used by German medical officers to detect typhus in occupied territories. It worked by identifying antibodies the body produced in response to the Rickettsia bacteria that caused the disease. But Lazowski knew something the SS doctors didn't. The test had a flaw. It could be fooled. If you injected a patient with a dead, harmless strain of a related bacteria, their immune system would produce antibodies that mimicked a real typhus infection. The test would come back positive, but the patient would be perfectly healthy. No fever, no rash, no death, just a false positive on a piece of paper. And if you did this to enough people, in enough villages, you could create the illusion of an outbreak, a ghost epidemic. The plan was insane. If the SS discovered the deception, Lazowski and everyone involved would be executed immediately, probably tortured first. But if it worked, if the Germans believed the epidemic was real, they would cordon off the area, and thousands of Jews hiding in those villages would be left untouched, protected not by walls or weapons, but by the invisible shield of fabricated disease. Lazowski looked at his colleague, Stanisław Matulewicz, and together they made the decision. They were going to create an epidemic that existed only on paper, and they were going to use the Reich's own fear to save lives. The clock was ticking, the trains were waiting, and in a small clinic in occupied Poland, 2 doctors began preparing the injections that would change everything. The first question Lazowski had to answer was simple but terrifying. How do you convince the most methodical, paranoid military force in history that a disease is real when it doesn't exist? The Nazi occupation authorities weren't amateurs. They had medical officers, laboratories, strict protocols. Every suspected typhus case had to be reported, blood samples taken, results verified. The Germans had seen real typhus outbreaks before. They knew what the disease looked like, how it spread, how entire communities could be wiped out in weeks. Typhus had killed more soldiers in previous wars than bullets ever did. It was the invisible enemy that turned battlefields into mass graves, and that's exactly why the Nazis were so terrified of it. Their entire war machine depended on healthy troops, functioning supply lines, and occupied populations that could be controlled. An epidemic could destabilize everything. So when reports of typhus surfaced, the response was always the same: isolate, quarantine, and avoid contact at all costs. Lazowski understood this. He wasn't just betting on fear. He was betting on German efficiency, on their obsessive need to follow procedure, and on the fact that no SS officer wanted to be the one who brought typhus back to his unit. But creating a fake epidemic wasn't as simple as just telling the Germans there was an outbreak. They would demand proof, blood tests, medical documentation, a pattern of infection that matched what they knew about the disease. Lazowski needed to manufacture evidence that would pass inspection, and that meant understanding exactly how the vial Felix test worked. The test itself was relatively straightforward. When a person contracted typhus, their immune system produced specific antibodies to fight the Rickettsia bacteria. The vial Felix test detected those antibodies by mixing the patient's blood serum with a sample of Proteus OX19 bacteria. If the antibodies were present, they would clump together with the bacteria, creating a visible reaction. Positive test, typhus confirmed, but here's the loophole Lazowski discovered. The human immune system couldn't tell the difference between live Rickettsia bacteria and certain dead harmless strains of Proteus bacteria. If you injected someone with a killed Proteus OX19 culture, their body would produce antibodies as if they had been exposed to typhus. The test would react, the results would come back positive, but the person would never get sick. Lazowski began experimenting quietly, carefully in his small clinic. He prepared injections using the dead Proteus bacteria and tested them on himself first. Within days, his blood showed a positive reaction to the vial Felix test. He was healthy, no symptoms, no fever. But on paper, according to German medical science, he had typhus. It worked. The next step was scaling up. He needed to convince the Germans that an entire region was infected, which meant he needed dozens, eventually hundreds of false positives. He couldn't just inject random people and hope the SS wouldn't notice inconsistencies. He had to be strategic. The fake cases had to appear in clusters, in villages that were already home to Jewish families in hiding. The spread had to look natural, following the logic of contagion, families living in close quarters, neighbors sharing wells. The disease moving from house to house like wildfire. Lazowski reached out to his colleague, Dr. Stanisław Matulewicz, a fellow physician who understood the stakes and was willing to risk everything. Together, they identified the villages around Rozwadów and Zbigniew, where Jewish families were hiding in barns, attics, and cellars, terrified of the next German sweep. These were small communities, rural and isolated, exactly the kind of places where a typhus outbreak would be believable. The 2 doctors quietly spread the word through trusted contacts. If the SS came asking, if there were inspections, people needed to cooperate. They would be injected with a harmless substance. Their blood would be drawn. The tests would come back positive, and then, if everything went according to plan, the Germans would leave and never come back. It was a gamble that required absolute trust, absolute secrecy, and nerves of steel. One informant, one suspicious SS officer, one inconsistency in the medical records, and the entire operation would collapse. By late 1943, the first injections had been administered. Lazowski and Matulewicz moved from village to village, treating patients in secrecy, carefully documenting each case to create a paper trail that would satisfy German bureaucracy. They filled out official reports, noting fever patterns that didn't exist, symptoms they fabricated, and a steadily rising infection count. Then, they waited. The reports reached the German medical authorities. Blood samples were collected and sent to labs, and when the results came back positive again and again from village after village, the reaction was exactly what Lazowski had hoped for. Panic. The SS declared the region infected. Quarantine signs went up. German troops stopped entering. And 8,000 people, most of them Jews who would have been deported to death camps, were suddenly invisible, protected by a disease that existed only in test tubes and on paper. The deception was working, but Lazowski knew that the hardest part was just beginning. Creating the initial illusion of an outbreak was one thing. Maintaining it, month after month under the scrutiny of German medical officers, who could show up unannounced at any moment, was something else entirely. The Nazis weren't going to simply accept a few positive test results and walk away forever. They would monitor the situation. They would send inspectors. They would want updates on infection rates, mortality statistics, quarantine protocols. Lazowski had to think like an epidemiologist now, not just a doctor. He had to create a believable disease curve, a pattern of infection that rose and fell naturally, that didn't spread too quickly or disappear too suddenly. If the outbreak seemed to vanish overnight, the Germans would grow suspicious. If it spread beyond the quarantine zone, they might send in disinfection units or worse, decide to liquidate the entire population to contain it. The disease had to stay contained, predictable, and just dangerous enough to keep the SS at a distance, but not so catastrophic that it forced them to take drastic action. Lazowski and Matulewicz developed a system. They carefully controlled the number of new cases, injecting only enough people to suggest the disease was spreading slowly through families and neighborhoods. They staggered the timing, ensuring that positive tests appeared in clusters that matched the expected incubation period of real typhus. They even fabricated recovery cases, reporting that some patients had survived the illness, which made the outbreak seem more realistic. Real typhus had a mortality rate of around 10 to 20% under poor conditions. So Lazowski made sure his fake epidemic followed similar statistics on paper. He reported deaths that never happened, attributing them to elderly patients or those already weakened by malnutrition. The death certificates were real, signed by him, filed with local authorities, and eventually passed up the chain to German record keepers. Everything had to look legitimate, because the moment the numbers didn't add up, the entire house of cards would collapse. But there was another layer of danger that kept Lazowski awake at night, the possibility of a German medical inspection team actually entering the quarantine zone and examining patients face to face. The Weil-Felix test could be fooled from a distance, blood samples sent to labs could be manipulated, but if a trained German doctor walked into a home expecting to see a typhus patient and instead found someone perfectly healthy, the game was over. Lazowski prepared for this scenario obsessively. He instructed families on how to behave if inspectors arrived. They were told to stay in bed, to complain of headaches and body aches, to appear weak and feverish. He even coached them on the specific symptoms of typhus, the characteristic rash that started on the torso, the high fever that came in waves, the confusion and delirium that accompanied severe cases. It was theater, a desperate performance where the audience held the power of life and death. Remarkably, for most of the occupation, the Germans never sent doctors into the infected zone. The mere presence of positive test results was enough to keep them out. Typhus was too dangerous, too unpredictable. The SS had seen entire battalions decimated by the disease on the Eastern Front. They had no interest in risking their own lives to verify what the paperwork already told them. The quarantine signs, the official reports, the steadily accumulating case files, All of it created a barrier more effective than barbed wire. The villages around Rozwadów became a ghost zone on German maps, a red-shaded area marked with warnings and avoided by patrols. Jewish families, who had been living in constant terror of deportation, suddenly found themselves in a strange kind of safety. They were still hungry, still hiding, still trapped, but the trains that had been coming for them stopped. The SS sweeps that had torn through neighboring towns never materialized. The roundups, the selections, the cattle cars to Treblinka, all of it passed them by. And the reason was invisible, a disease that didn't exist. Lazowski continued the charade for over 2 years, from 1943, until the Soviet army finally liberated the region in 1945. During that time, he injected hundreds of people, filed thousands of pages of false medical reports, and maintained the illusion of an epidemic that, by all official records, infected more than 3,000 individuals. The actual number of lives saved is harder to calculate. Historians estimate that around 8,000 Jews who would have been deported to death camps survived because they were living in or near the quarantine zone. 8,000 people who should have been erased from existence, who instead lived to see liberation, to rebuild families, to tell their children what happened. And almost none of them knew at the time that the epidemic that saved them was nothing more than dead bacteria, a clever doctor, and an elaborate lie told to the face of evil. The psychological toll of living a lie this enormous cannot be overstated. Lazowski wasn't just risking his own life. Every injection he administered, every false report he filed, every conversation he had with a German medical officer was a potential death sentence, not only for him, but for his wife, his children, and every single person who knew the truth. The Gestapo had perfected the art of interrogation. They didn't just execute conspirators, they tortured them first, extracting names, addresses, every detail of resistance networks. One mistake, one moment of hesitation in front of the wrong person, and the entire operation would unravel. Lazowski carried this weight silently. He couldn't confide in most of his patients. He couldn't explain to the families he was protecting why their blood tests came back positive, but they never got sick. To the outside world, even to many of the people he was saving, he had to maintain the fiction that the epidemic was real, that the danger was genuine, that the quarantine was a tragedy rather than a masterpiece of deception. There were close calls. On at least one occasion, a German medical officer became suspicious of the unusually low mortality rate in the quarantine zone. Real typhus outbreaks in other parts of occupied Poland were killing 20, sometimes 30% of infected populations, especially in areas where malnutrition and overcrowding were rampant. But in Lazowski's zone, the death rate seemed oddly controlled. The officer requested a meeting, demanding an explanation. Lazowski had to think fast. He explained that the lower mortality was due to early detection and strict isolation protocols. He claimed that because the outbreak had been identified quickly, patients were quarantined before the disease could spread to the most vulnerable. He presented meticulously kept records showing that the majority of infections were in younger, healthier individuals who had a better chance of survival. He even blamed the low death rate on the rural nature of the villages, arguing that the open air and less crowded living conditions slowed transmission and reduced severity. The German officer reviewed the paperwork, asked a few more questions, and eventually accepted the explanation. Lazowski walked out of that meeting with his heart pounding, knowing how close he had come to exposure. Another danger came from within the Polish community itself. Not everyone could be trusted. There were collaborators, informants who traded information to the Germans in exchange for food, protection, or simply out of fear. Lazowski had to be extraordinarily careful about who he brought into the secret. He operated on a strict need-to-know basis. Even some of the people he injected weren't told the full truth. They were simply informed that the injection would protect them, that it was a precaution, a medical procedure to keep them safe. Only a handful of individuals, his closest colleagues and a few trusted resistance contacts, knew that the epidemic was fabricated. This compartmentalization was essential. If someone was arrested and interrogated, they couldn't reveal what they didn't know. But it also meant that Lazowski carried the burden almost entirely alone, unable to share the fear, the doubt, the constant anxiety that one day the deception would be discovered. The villages themselves became strange places during this period. They were simultaneously death zones and sanctuaries. German soldiers avoided them, but so did many Poles from neighboring areas who believed the typhus threat was real. Supply lines were disrupted. Trade stopped. The communities became isolated, cut off from the rest of the occupation, which in some ways made them safer, but also created genuine hardship. Food was scarce. Medicine was almost non-existent. People were genuinely suffering, not from typhus, but from the consequences of being quarantined. Lazowski found himself treating real illnesses, malnutrition, infections, injuries, all while maintaining the fiction of the epidemic. He was a doctor trying to save lives in the middle of a war, while simultaneously running a covert operation that required him to lie to almost everyone he encountered. The duality of his existence was exhausting, yet he continued. Every morning, he woke up knowing that today could be the day the Germans discovered the truth. Every knock on the door could be the Gestapo. Every request for medical records could be the inspection that revealed the fraud. But he also knew that every day the deception held was another day that thousands of people remained alive. Every week that passed without a deportation order was a small victory. Lazowski didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a doctor doing what needed to be done. But what he was doing required a kind of courage that most people will never have to summon. The courage to lie to killers, to gamble with his own life and the lives of everyone around him, and to do it all in silence, knowing that if he succeeded, the world might never know his name. By 1944, the war was turning against Germany, but that didn't make Lazowski's situation any safer. In fact, it made it more dangerous. As the Soviet army pushed westward and the Reich began losing ground on the Eastern Front, the Nazi occupation forces in Poland became more paranoid, more brutal, more desperate. They intensified their efforts to eliminate any remaining Jewish populations, accelerating deportations, and executing anyone suspected of harboring or aiding Jews. The Gestapo conducted random sweeps through villages, checking papers, searching homes, looking for any sign of resistance activity. Lazowski knew that the tightening noose meant increased scrutiny. The Germans were becoming less predictable, more willing to take risks they wouldn't have considered earlier in the war. The question wasn't if they would eventually investigate the quarantine zone more closely, but when. The breakthrough moment, the incident that could have ended everything, came in the spring of 1944. A high-ranking German medical officer, suspicious of the prolonged quarantine and the unusual pattern of the outbreak, decided to conduct a personal inspection. He arrived unannounced with a small team demanding to examine patients firsthand and review all medical documentation. Lazowski received word of the visit only hours before the Germans arrived. There was no time to prepare elaborate cover stories or coach dozens of families. He had to make a split-second decision, allow the inspection and hope his patients could convincingly play the role of typhus victims, or try to deflect the Germans at the door and risk raising even more suspicion. He chose to cooperate, betting that the officer's fear of infection would work in his favor. When the German medical team arrived, Lazowski met them at the edge of the quarantine zone. He was calm, professional, every inch the competent physician managing a public health crisis. He handed over meticulously organized files, charts showing infection rates, patient histories, treatment logs. Everything looked legitimate, because Lazowski had spent months ensuring that it would. Then came the critical moment. The officer wanted to see actual patients. Lazowski led him to a home where he had previously injected a family and instructed them on what to expect. Inside, the German officer found a middle-aged man lying in bed covered in blankets, complaining of severe headache and body pains. His wife stood nearby, looking exhausted and frightened. The officer asked questions. How long had the symptoms lasted? When did the fever start? Had anyone else in the household fallen ill? Lazowski translated, guiding the conversation, subtly coaching the responses. The patient played his part perfectly, describing symptoms he didn't have, groaning convincingly, looking genuinely unwell. But the German officer wasn't satisfied. He wanted to examine the patient physically, to check for the characteristic typhus rash. This was the moment Lazowski had dreaded. A trained medical officer conducting a hands-on examination could potentially spot the deception. Lazowski stepped forward and politely but firmly suggested that close physical contact was extremely dangerous. He reminded the officer that typhus was transmitted by lice, that the patient and his bedding were almost certainly contaminated, and that even brief exposure could result in infection. He offered to draw blood for additional testing instead, allowing the officer to verify the diagnosis through laboratory results rather than direct examination. The officer hesitated. Lazowski could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Was the risk of infection worth verifying what the paperwork already confirmed? After what felt like an eternity, the officer stepped back. He declined the physical examination. He accepted the offer of blood samples, which Lazowski knew would come back positive because the patient had been injected weeks earlier. The inspection continued through 2 more homes, each time with Lazowski carefully managing the encounter, keeping the Germans at a safe distance, using their own fear as a shield. After several hours, the German medical team left. They filed a report confirming the presence of typhus in the region and recommending that the quarantine remain in place indefinitely. Lazowski had passed the test, but he knew he had been extraordinarily lucky. The officer had been cautious enough to avoid close contact, more concerned with his own safety than with thoroughly investigating inconsistencies. If a more skeptical or braver officer had insisted on hands-on examinations, if the Germans had brought their own medical equipment and conducted tests on site, rather than sending samples to distant labs, the entire operation would have been exposed. Lazowski realized that he was operating on borrowed time. The deception had held for over a year, but every day brought new risks, new opportunities for discovery. And yet, he couldn't stop. The trains were still running, the camps were still operating, and as long as the quarantine held, 8,000 people remained beyond the reach of the SS. As 1944 dragged on, and the sound of Soviet artillery grew closer from the east, the nature of Lazowski's challenge evolved. The Germans were no longer just occupiers managing a health crisis. They were a retreating army, increasingly disorganized, increasingly violent. In other parts of Poland, as Nazi forces prepared to withdraw, they implemented scorched earth policies. They burned villages, executed civilians, and destroyed anything that could be useful to the advancing Soviets. Jewish populations that had survived in hiding were often massacred in final killing sprees before the Germans retreated. Lazowski understood that the quarantine zone, which had protected his community for so long, could suddenly become a liability. If the Germans decided that a disease-ridden area was too dangerous to leave intact, they might simply eliminate the entire population to prevent the epidemic from spreading or falling into Soviet hands. Lazowski faced an impossible dilemma. He had to maintain the illusion of the epidemic to keep the Germans out, but he also had to ensure that the Germans didn't view the zone as such a threat that they decided to liquidate it entirely. This required a delicate balance, a careful calibration of the threat level. He began gradually reducing the number of reported new cases, creating the impression that the outbreak was slowly burning itself out. He filed reports suggesting that improved quarantine measures and the harsh winter had limited transmission. The epidemic, according to his documentation, was still present, but no longer spreading aggressively. This gave the Germans a reason to continue avoiding the area without viewing it as an existential threat that required extreme action. It was a psychological game played at the highest stakes, where Lazowski had to anticipate how desperate, paranoid military officers would interpret medical data while planning their retreat. Meanwhile, inside the quarantine zone, life had taken on a surreal quality. The Jewish families hiding there had lived under the shadow of the fake epidemic for nearly 2 years. Some of them had figured out that something wasn't quite right, that the disease everyone feared never seemed to actually kill anyone they knew, that the symptoms never matched the horror stories they'd heard about real typhus outbreaks. But they didn't ask questions. They understood, in the way that people living under occupation learn to understand, that their survival depended on maintaining the fiction. Children grew up in this strange bubble, told to stay hidden, to pretend to be sick if strangers came, to never speak about what was really happening. Families celebrated births, mourned real deaths from other causes, fell in love, argued, lived their lives in the shadow of a lie that was somehow more protective than any truth could have been. Lazowski himself was exhausted. 2 years of living with constant fear, of maintaining perfect composure in front of German officers, of managing hundreds of medical records and injections, of lying to almost everyone he met, had taken a toll. He had aged visibly, his hair graying, his hands sometimes shaking when he thought no one was watching. His wife knew the truth, and she lived with her own terror, knowing that if her husband was discovered, the Gestapo would come for her and their children as well. They had conversations late at night, whispered discussions about what would happen if the deception failed, whether they should try to flee, whether there was anywhere safe to go. But Lazowski always came back to the same conclusion. He couldn't abandon the operation. Too many people depended on it. Too many lives hung in the balance. He had started something that was bigger than himself, and he had to see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. The waiting became unbearable. By late 1944 and early 1945, it was clear that the Soviet army would eventually reach their region. The question was whether the Germans would withdraw peacefully or destroy everything in their path as they left. Lazowski heard reports from other towns of massacres, of wells poisoned, of buildings burned. He knew that the quarantine zone, with its population of hidden Jews and its documented epidemic, could easily become a target in the chaos of retreat. Every night he listened for the sound of trucks, of soldiers, of the violence that could arrive without warning. And every morning that he woke up and found the village still standing, still protected by the invisible shield of a disease that had never existed, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they would survive long enough to see liberation. Liberation came in the winter of 1945, but not in the way anyone expected. The Soviet army swept through the region faster than the Germans could organize a proper retreat. There were skirmishes, scattered fighting, but no systematic destruction of the villages. The Wehrmacht was in full collapse, more concerned with escaping westward than with executing final orders. When Soviet troops approached the quarantine zone, they encountered the warning signs, the official Nazi documentation marking the area as infected with typhus. The Soviet Medical Corps, battle-hardened and experienced with real disease outbreaks that had devastated their own ranks during the war, took the warning seriously. They established their own perimeter, sent in scouts with protective equipment, and began investigating. This presented Lazowski with a new and unexpected problem: how to explain to the liberating army that the epidemic they were so carefully avoiding was completely fake. Lazowski made contact with the Soviet medical officers and requested a meeting. It was a strange, almost absurd moment. After 2 years of deceiving the Nazis, he now had to convince the Soviets that he had been lying the entire time and that they should trust him despite that lie. He brought his medical records, his injection logs, everything that documented the deception. He explained the Weil Felix test manipulation, the strategic use of false positives, the reason behind the elaborate fraud. The Soviet doctors were initially skeptical. They had seen too much death, too much suffering, to easily believe that an entire epidemic could be fabricated. They demanded proof. Lazowski offered to have every person in the quarantine zone examined by Soviet physicians. He invited them to conduct their own blood tests to look for actual symptoms, to verify that despite 2 years of documented typhus cases, nobody was actually sick. The examination took several days. Soviet medical teams went house to house, checking the populations that had supposedly been ravaged by disease. They found families that were malnourished, traumatized, exhausted from years of hiding and fear, but they found no typhus, not a single active case. The blood tests showed antibodies, evidence of exposure, but no live infection, no fever, no rash, no lice infestation. The Soviets began to understand. What they were looking at wasn't a medical miracle or an unusually mild outbreak. It was something far more remarkable, a systematic, scientifically executed deception that had fooled the Nazi occupation for over 2 years. The Soviet officers, many of whom had witnessed acts of resistance across Eastern Europe, were astounded. They had seen sabotage, assassination, armed rebellion, but nothing quite like this. Lazowski had weaponized medicine itself, turning a diagnostic test into a shield that protected thousands. As word spread through the liberated villages that the epidemic had been fake, that the disease they had lived in fear of for 2 years had never existed, reactions were mixed. Some people were angry, feeling they had been deceived even by those trying to protect them. Others were overwhelmed with gratitude, finally understanding why the Germans had never come, why the deportations had stopped, why they were still alive when so many others had perished. Jewish families emerged from hiding, blinking in the winter sunlight, realizing that they had survived not through luck or coincidence, but through the calculated brilliance of 2 doctors who had risked everything. The celebrations were muted, tempered by the knowledge of how many had been lost elsewhere, how many communities had been completely erased. But there was also profound relief, the slow realization that against impossible odds, in the face of industrial genocide, this one small corner of occupied Poland had been saved. Lazowski himself felt no sense of triumph. He was exhausted, emotionally drained and deeply aware of how narrowly they had all escaped disaster. He knew that the deception could have failed at any moment, that one suspicious officer, one careful inspection, one informant could have resulted in mass executions. He had gambled with thousands of lives, and while the gamble had paid off, he understood that it could easily have gone the other way. In the weeks following liberation, as Soviet authorities documented Nazi crimes and began the process of rebuilding, Lazowski quietly returned to his medical practice. He treated patients, delivered babies, set broken bones, and tried to process what he had lived through. He didn't speak much about the epidemic, didn't seek recognition or praise. To him, it had simply been what needed to be done, the only option available to a doctor, sworn to save lives in a world determined to extinguish them. In the immediate aftermath of the war, as Europe began the painful process of counting its dead and documenting the Holocaust, Lazowski's story remained largely unknown. The chaos of liberation, the staggering scale of atrocities being uncovered across Poland and Germany, the millions of displaced persons trying to find surviving family members, all of it overshadowed individual acts of rescue. Lazowski made no effort to publicize what he had done. In fact, he actively avoided attention. He understood that in the uncertain political landscape of post-war Poland, now falling under Soviet control, drawing attention to his wartime activities could be dangerous. The Soviets were suspicious of anyone who had operated independently during the occupation, anyone who had maintained contact with German authorities, even for resistance purposes. Lazowski feared that his elaborate deception, which required regular interaction with Nazi medical officers, could be misinterpreted as collaboration. So he stayed silent, continuing his work as a country doctor, and the story of the fake epidemic faded into obscurity. The few people who knew the truth were scattered. Stanisław Matulewicz, Lazowski's partner in the operation, had also survived the war, and similarly chose to remain quiet about their wartime activities. The Jewish families who had been saved were dealing with their own trauma, trying to rebuild shattered lives, searching for relatives who had been deported and murdered. Many of them emigrated, leaving Poland for Israel, the United States, or other countries where they hoped to escape the haunted landscape of their survival. Some took the story with them, sharing it quietly within their families, but it never reached a broader audience. The Soviet authorities, focused on their own narrative of liberation and heroism, had little interest in highlighting a story that centered on individual initiative and scientific deception rather than armed resistance or partisan warfare. And so, one of the most ingenious rescue operations of World War II simply disappeared from the historical record. Lazowski himself eventually left Poland. The communist government's increasing authoritarianism and anti-Semitism made life difficult for anyone associated with wartime Jewish rescue efforts. In 1958, he emigrated to the United States, settling in Chicago, where he worked as a physician and tried to build a new life far from the trauma of occupation. Even there, he rarely spoke about what he had done. His children grew up knowing their father had been a doctor during the war, but the details remained vague, fragments of stories that were never fully told. It wasn't shame or regret that kept Lazowski silent. It was something else, a deep humility, a belief that he had simply done his job, and perhaps also a survivor's guilt, the knowledge that his cleverness had saved thousands while 6 million others had perished. The story might have been lost forever if not for a chance encounter decades later. In the 1970s, a historian researching Polish resistance activities stumbled across a fragmentary Soviet military report that mentioned a suspicious typhus outbreak in the Rozwadów area that had turned out to be fabricated. Intrigued, the historian began investigating, tracking down survivors, reviewing medical records that had somehow been preserved. The trail eventually led to Lazowski in Chicago. By then, he was an elderly man, retired from medical practice, living quietly with his wife. When the historian contacted him and asked about the epidemic, Lazowski was initially reluctant to discuss it. He worried that no one would believe him, that the story sounded too improbable, too much like fiction. But eventually he agreed to tell his story, to sit for interviews, to explain in detail how he and Matulewicz had created an epidemic out of nothing but dead bacteria and carefully manipulated paperwork. The historian published an article in a medical journal in 1977. More than 30 years after the events it described, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Medical professionals were fascinated by the scientific ingenuity, the exploitation of a diagnostic test's weakness. Historians recognized it as one of the most unique rescue operations of the Holocaust. Holocaust survivors and Jewish organizations sought out Lazowski, wanting to honor him, to ensure his story was preserved. But even then, even as recognition finally came, Lazowski remained modest. In interviews, he always emphasized that he had been terrified the entire time, that the plan could easily have failed, that luck had played as much a role as cleverness. He deflected praise, insisting that any doctor in his position would have done the same thing. Those who knew him understood that this wasn't false modesty. Lazowski genuinely believed he had simply fulfilled his oath as a physician, to protect life, no matter the cost. As Lazowski's story began to circulate in academic and medical communities during the late 1970s and 1980s, researchers started to fully appreciate the audacity and precision of what he had accomplished. Medical historians analyzed the Weil-Felix test in detail, examining exactly how Lazowski had exploited its vulnerabilities. They discovered that his understanding of immunology was remarkably advanced for a country doctor, working in isolation during wartime. He had grasped concepts about cross-reactivity and antibody production that many trained researchers of that era didn't fully understand. More importantly, he had recognized that the Nazis, despite their obsession with racial pseudoscience and medical experimentation, were operating with diagnostic tools that had significant limitations. The Weil-Felix test was reliable enough for mass screening, but it wasn't perfect, and Lazowski had found that imperfection and turned it into a weapon. The elegance of the deception impressed scientists. It required no sophisticated equipment, no access to laboratories, nothing that would have been impossible for a rural physician to obtain. Just knowledge, courage, and an understanding of human psychology. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the operation, the detail that researchers kept returning to, was how Lazowski had managed to sustain the deception for over 2 years without a single catastrophic failure. Most resistance operations eventually failed. Networks were infiltrated, safe houses discovered, forged documents detected. The longer an operation ran, the greater the chance of exposure. Yet Lazowski's fake epidemic had held up under repeated German inspections, bureaucratic reviews, and the paranoid scrutiny of SS medical officers trained to detect deception. Historians began to understand that this wasn't just luck. Lazowski had built multiple layers of protection into his system. The medical documentation was flawless because he had studied German administrative procedures obsessively. The patient testimonies were convincing because he had carefully selected and coached people who understood what was at stake. The infection patterns looked natural because he had deliberately modeled them on real epidemiological data. Every detail had been thought through, every potential point of failure reinforced. It was, in essence, a masterpiece of operational security executed by someone with no formal training in espionage or resistance work. Survivors began coming forward with their own memories of those years. An elderly woman in Israel remembered being injected by Lazowski when she was a teenager, hiding in her family's barn. She recalled how terrified she had been when her blood test came back positive, how she thought she was going to die, and how confused she was when weeks passed and she never got sick. A man in New York described watching German soldiers set up quarantine barriers at the edge of his village and then retreat, never entering, never conducting the house-to-house searches that had destroyed neighboring communities. He had lived his entire adult life, wondering why his village had been spared when so many others weren't. Now, decades later, he finally understood. The testimonies painted a picture of communities that had existed in a strange limbo, protected by an invisible shield they didn't fully comprehend, living with fear and uncertainty, but ultimately surviving when survival seemed impossible. Recognition came slowly but meaningfully. In 1983, Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial, recognized Lazowski and Matulewicz as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The ceremony was emotional. Lazowski, by then in his 70s, stood before an audience of survivors, some of whom had been saved by his actions 40 years earlier. He was visibly uncomfortable with the attention, repeatedly insisting that Matulewicz deserved equal credit, that the people who had trusted him with their lives had been the truly brave ones. But the survivors wouldn't let him deflect. They knew what he had done. They knew that without his brilliance and courage, they wouldn't have been standing there, wouldn't have had children and grandchildren, wouldn't have rebuilt lives from the ashes of genocide. Medical organizations began inviting Lazowski to speak at conferences, not about the Holocaust specifically, but about medical ethics, about what it means to be a physician in times of moral crisis. His story became a case study in medical schools, an example of how scientific knowledge can be used for humanitarian purposes, how a doctor's oath to do no harm can extend beyond individual patients to entire communities. Lazowski spoke carefully in these settings, always emphasizing the specific circumstances that had made his deception possible, warning against viewing it as a simple blueprint that could be replicated. He pointed out that he had been extraordinarily lucky, that the plan had nearly failed multiple times, that medical deception was a dangerous tool that could easily backfire. But he also affirmed a deeper principle, that when confronted with systematic evil, when all conventional options have been exhausted, creativity and courage become moral imperatives. Sometimes, he said, saving lives requires more than following protocols. Sometimes it requires breaking them. Eugene Lazowski died in 2006 in Eugene, Oregon, at the age of 92. His obituary appeared in a few newspapers, noting his work as a physician and his recognition as righteous among the nations, but most Americans who read it had no idea who he was or what he had accomplished. Even today, more than 75 years after the end of World War II, his story remains largely unknown outside academic and medical circles. There are no major films about him, no best-selling books, no monuments in his honor beyond a small plaque in Poland. His name doesn't appear in most Holocaust education curricula. When people think of Holocaust rescuers, they think of Oskar Schindler, whose factory saved over 1,000 Jews, or Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who issued protective passports in Hungary. They don't think of the quiet Polish doctor who saved 8,000 people with nothing but test tubes and a brilliant understanding of fear. Why has this story been forgotten? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the rescue itself. Lazowski's operation left no dramatic visual evidence. There were no lists of names, no factory records, no photographs of people being smuggled to safety. The rescue was invisible, bureaucratic, a series of falsified medical reports and manipulated blood tests. It doesn't fit the narrative template that popular culture prefers. The heroic confrontation, the narrow escape, the moment of visible courage. Lazowski's courage was quieter, more cerebral, expressed through scientific knowledge and psychological manipulation rather than physical bravery. It's harder to dramatize a man carefully preparing bacterial cultures in a small clinic than it is to show someone hiding refugees in an attic or forging identity papers while the Gestapo pounds on the door. But the invisibility of Lazowski's heroism doesn't make it less remarkable. If anything, it makes it more so. There's also a deeper reason why this story matters now in 2025 more than ever before. We live in an age of information warfare, of sophisticated deceptions, of truth being manipulated for both good and evil purposes. Lazowski's story reminds us that deception is not inherently immoral. Context matters. Intent matters. He lied to save lives. He fabricated evidence to protect the innocent. He used scientific knowledge not to harm, but to create a shield against systematic murder. In an era where we're constantly told to trust the science, to follow the data, to believe the official reports, Lazowski's story is a powerful reminder that science and data can be tools of liberation as much as instruments of control. He proved that knowledge, wielded by someone with courage and moral clarity, can defeat even the most powerful and brutal regime. The 8,000 people Lazowski saved went on to have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Demographic researchers estimate that his actions resulted in tens of thousands of living descendants today, people who exist because one doctor refused to accept that there was nothing he could do. Some of those descendants know the story of how their family survived. Others don't, living ordinary lives unaware that their existence is the result of an extraordinary deception carried out in a small Polish village during the darkest period of human history. But whether they know it or not, they are living proof that individual action matters, that one person with knowledge and courage can change the course of history, that even when evil seems overwhelming and unstoppable, there are always possibilities for resistance. Eugene Lazowski never sought fame. He never wrote a memoir, never hired a publicist, never campaigned for recognition. He spent his final years as he had spent most of his life, quietly, competently, helping people without expecting anything in return. But his legacy endures in the descendants of the people he saved, in the medical students who study his case, in the historians who ensure his story isn't lost, and in anyone who hears his story and understands that courage doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like a doctor, alone in a clinic, preparing an injection that will produce a false positive on a blood test. Sometimes it looks like a lie told to save a life. Sometimes it looks like a fake epidemic that was more powerful than any army. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names we never learn, whose actions leave no monuments, whose courage exists only in the lives they saved and the stories that, if we're lucky, someone remembers to tell.